At a formal gala where every eye in the room tracked the most powerful woman present, no one noticed the small girl gripping her hand, not until the child turned slowly, deliberately, and pulled the woman toward the quiet man standing alone near the east windows. She pulled her by the hand, through the gathered crowd, without apology, without explanation, until they were standing in front of him. And then she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Dad, marry her." The room stopped breathing. No one laughed. No one moved. No one reached for their drinks or cleared their throat, or found anything to look at except the three people standing at the center of a silence that had no clean edge, because only minutes before that moment, that same woman had come within a single sentence of destroying both of their lives, and the little girl, who was 6 years old and carried a stuffed rabbit and said very little, had been the only one in the room who had seen what everyone else had missed. If a child can see what a grown heart refuses to admit, what does that say about the rest of us? Stay until the end. The truth is worth it. Julian Carter was 28 years old, and he had the kind of face that made strangers assume his life had been harder than most. Not because of any particular scar or visible wound, but because of the way his eyes moved through a room quietly, carefully, like a man who had learned long ago that the world rewards those who pay attention and punishes those who don't. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a way that might have seemed intimidating if not for the permanent softness that lived around the corners of his mouth. Even when he was exhausted, and he was almost always exhausted, something warm remained in his expression, something that people who had lost too much tend to carry without meaning to. He had been a software engineer once, not the casual, contractor kind, but the real thing, the kind of engineer who understood systems not just as code but as logic made physical, as invisible architecture that held entire operations together. He had worked for firms that paid well and asked more than was reasonable. And for several years he had been exactly the kind of man those firms built themselves around. Then everything changed. He left. He didn't talk about why with the people he'd met since, and those who had been around before were careful not to ask. What he had instead of that former life was Sophie. Sophie Carter was 6 years old and said very little, which was precisely how she said everything. She had her father's dark eyes, the same careful watchfulness, the same slow way of taking in a room before committing to any reaction, but where Julian's wariness had been earned through disappointment, Sophie's seemed almost innate, as though she had arrived in the world already knowing that most things deserved a second look. She carried a stuffed rabbit with her nearly everywhere. The toy had lost most of its original color, and one of its button eyes sat slightly lower than the other, giving it an expression that might have been melancholy or might have been wisdom, depending on how you looked at it. Sophie never named it anything. She didn't seem to think it required a name. The two of them had been managing on their own for 2 years. Managing was the right word, not thriving, not failing, but navigating a narrow corridor between stability and the kind of unraveling that happens slowly, and then all at once. Julian took contract work when it came, which it did reliably enough because he was good. He was, by almost any professional measure, exceptionally good. The work he'd done before his life shifted had left behind a reputation that was hard to outrun even when he tried. Jobs found him. He took the ones that paid quickly and required the least explanation. The latest contract had brought him to Hargrove Technologies, one of those companies large enough to have its own gravity, pulling dozens of smaller firms into its orbit and calling the result a portfolio. The building occupied 4 floors of a glass tower downtown, and the people inside it moved with the particular urgency common to organizations that have confused motion for progress. The contract was temporary, which was how Julian preferred things now. He had been brought in to untangle a critical system failure that the internal team had been unable to resolve for 11 days. Nobody told him directly, but he understood from the silence and the sidelong looks that several careers were quietly balancing on the outcome. Alexandra Hayes was 27 years old and had been CEO of Hargrove Technologies for 14 months, which was, by most accounts, either an extraordinary achievement or a cautionary tale, depending on who you asked and how well they knew her. She was not someone who inspired neutral feelings. People who worked for her tended to describe her in terms that sounded like compliments when written down but felt like something else when spoken aloud. Precise, decisive, unsentimental. She had restructured the company's leadership twice in her first year. She had eliminated entire departments. She had done all of it with a clarity of purpose that left very little room for the kind of slow, human grief that accompanies institutional change. She was also, though no one would have said this to her face, lonely in a way that had calcified over so many years it no longer registered as pain. It was simply background noise. Simply the way things were. She did not believe in family. She did not believe in love, not the romantic kind, not the permanent kind. She had reasons for this, as people always do. She kept them private, as people often choose to. What she had instead was work, and work, she had decided long ago, was enough. The first time Julian walked into a Hargrove conference room, he was 10 minutes early, and Sophie was with him. This was not the plan. The woman who sometimes watched Sophie after school had called that morning with a family emergency, and the backup agency Julian used hadn't been able to place anyone by 8 o'clock. He had spent 45 minutes on the phone trying to solve the problem, and then, with no solution available and a meeting that could not be moved, he had done what single parents eventually learn to do. He had brought her along. Sophie sat beside him at the far end of the conference table with her rabbit on her lap and a coloring book open in front of her that she wasn't coloring. She was watching the room with the same careful attention she brought to everything, her small hands folded on top of the rabbit's ears. Alexandra walked in 7 minutes after the meeting was scheduled to begin, which the other attendees had apparently learned to expect, because no one checked the clock when she entered. She moved with the economy of someone who had trained herself not to waste motion. She sat, opened a thin folder, and began speaking before anyone else had entirely settled. She noticed Julian the way she noticed most things, a brief categorization, a rapid internal filing. She registered his clothing, which was clean and professional but not expensive, and made an unconscious note of it. She registered Sophie's presence at the table with something closer to actual surprise, but suppressed the reaction before it could show. She said nothing about the child. Julian watched her the same way he watched systems looking for the logic, the architecture, the place where the structure either held together or began to show its faults. She explained the problem in about 4 minutes. 11 days ago, a critical integration system linking 3 of the company's primary data channels had begun producing cascading errors. 2 internal engineers had worked around the clock to find the source. Neither had succeeded. The company was losing functionality across all 3 channels. Every time the system attempted its nightly reconciliation, they had manually overridden the process for 11 days, which was not sustainable. Julian had been brought in because he had once built a similar system for a company that had since been absorbed into Hargrove's portfolio, and someone had pulled that file. She looked at him across the table when she finished. "Do you have questions?" "Several," he said. "But I'd like to look at the logs first." She nodded once, which was apparently her version of approval. The other people in the room seemed to relax slightly when she looked away from Julian. He didn't relax. He was already turning something over in his mind. It was Sophie who interrupted the silence. She didn't speak loudly. She never did. She tugged once, lightly, on Julian's sleeve, and when he leaned down, she whispered against his ear. But in the particular way of 6-year-olds, who do not fully understand the acoustics of quiet rooms. "Is she sad, Dad?" Julian straightened slowly. Across the table, Alexandra had not moved. Her expression had not changed. Her pen rested against the folder, her posture still contained and correct. "What makes you ask that?" he whispered back. Sophie considered this for a moment, the way she considered most things with a patience that didn't belong to her age. "She looks like she's holding something very heavy," she said, "but pretending she isn't." Julian said nothing. He looked at Alexandra. She was now speaking to a colleague on her left, making a point about timelines. Her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who expected to be listened to and had learned not to soften the expectation. There was nothing visibly heavy about her. There was no visible strain. There was, if anything, a kind of practiced impenetrability that read as the opposite of burden. And yet, there was something in the way she held herself a fraction of tension across the shoulders, a quality of stillness that wasn't quite restfulness that Julian, in his own quiet way, recognized. He said nothing about it. He turned his attention back to the problem at hand, because the problem at hand was the thing he had been paid to solve, and Julian Carter had learned, among many other things, that some observations are better carried in silence than spoken aloud. Sophie went back to not coloring her coloring book. Alexandra finished her point about timelines, closed the folder, and left the room without looking back. Over the following 2 weeks, Julian worked the way he always worked, methodically, without fanfare. In the hours between the things that made up the rest of his life, he was at his desk early and stayed late on the 3 evenings per week when Sophie's after-school program ran long enough to give him time. On the other days, She came with him when there was no alternative.